Hey guys, it's me, EODGamer here, and today we have an interesting one because we are going to be exploring crit rate versus crit damage and when one stat is better than the other, and out of the two, I think you'll be surprised which one I actually think outperforms, especially in the early game. Some of you might be watching this video, clicking on it and like, duh, of course Yenting and Bronya crit damage is going to outperform because they have crit rate inbuilt into their kit already. I'm not even going to be talking about this. Of course, I know that there are exceptions to the rule, but I want to focus on like plain vanilla characters who don't have much bias towards one stat over the other. For example, of course, Danheng, for example, is one of them that prefers a bit more crit rate rather than crit damage. So these kind of like exceptions, we're not going to even talk about them. I want to explore specifically on the generic character and why one stat is actually better than the other. Of course, first things first, the more you have of both is of course the better, and if you have to factor in other stuff, for example like attack, break effect, energy restoration, the overall kit into perspective, right now in this video we are really just specifically looking at these two stats first and then exploring the logic behind why one would be better than the other. Okay, so long story short, I think who will actually get value out of this is, for example, those of you who maybe are trying to switch from one piece to another piece and are like not at end game yet where you can just steamroll the memory of chaos very quickly. I think you'll feel a ton of value in this video and what I'm about to share with you too. For those of you who haven't seen the other video, I'll just put the chart up here. You can find it on hsrguide.com. I'll link the link in the video description below. This is something that we talked about previously. If you want to know how to read it and how to actually utilize it better, I'll leave the video that I talked about it as well somewhere in the links below. You can check it out if you want. I'm not even talking about, for example, going from one color category, which is like the weaker set, to, for example, going rightwards into another category set, which is of course the stronger ratios. I'm talking about actually going along like similar ratios. For example, like maybe a 1.55 and then the other one there's 1.55, like maybe you have a lot more crit damage and less crit rate. We are going along the axis rather than talking about like net increases going towards the right, of course. Why this actually matters and why I'm saying there's going to be a difference is I think the first thing a lot of us preconceived notions coming to the game is based on two things. The first is any of us who came from PvP turn-based games, for example like Epic 7 or maybe Fire Emblem Heroes. These two games, generally you want to of course have higher amounts of crit rate for more consistency so you can one-shot the enemies in PvP in any arena, because missing a crit could be quite devastating to you. On the other hand, we have the second group of people who actually came from Genshin Impact, where everyone knows like the 1:2 ratio is like the golden ratio in a lot of things as well. And I'm here to actually debunk those two theories. I want to explain to you why being in the early game, actually a certain stat is far more important than the other stat. In order to understand what I'm about to say, we must understand this concept of damage ranges. So what exactly is a damage range that I'm talking about? Of course, everyone knows, for example, if I smack this crit real quick, no matter how it works, I'll always be hitting the same amount of damage if I crit or not. So it's not as if there's like an absolute damage range where each time I attack there is some kind of RNG from a low attack, low damage to a high damage multiplier. That is not the case. What I'm talking about damage ranges here is actually taking a step back from the two-dimensional damage and as well as crit rate, crit damage kind of ratio and all the other stats. We are talking about it in terms of turn order. What do I mean by that? If we look, for example, in like Memory of Chaos, for example, here that we see Memory of Chaos 10, by and large, maybe each half is going to take about 10 turns, we can say, to clear the entire floor as well. For example, if you have a fast character like Zilla, you most likely will be taking a total of 20 turns in that order, and out of these 20 turns when you're entering one stage, for example this battle, you're going to have a certain multiplier, for example the amount of damage you are expected to do. This is of course calculated based on your crit rate, multiplied by crit damage, and for example multiplying the number of turns that we have, we can kind of see like the average amount of damage we are expected to do within this particular turn. Now this is where what I want to talk about in terms of favoring one stat over the other makes a lot of sense, especially if we are in the early game. For the early game, especially the two assumptions of early game is like you can't clear the stage reliably, and secondly also maybe you don't have the resources to have everything min-maxed to the full and everything is like 100-200 ratio already. Maybe you're like me in this image here, or maybe slightly less crit ratio, then this is far more applicable. And what I mean by early game, if you're in the early game and you can't clear the particular floor, what you actually want is to increase your damage range, which means the lowest, of course, for the damage range is missing all your crits in the 10 rounds that you have. Here, if you have all 10 rounds and every time I attack with Zealer, I miss crit on every single one. So that is like the low end of a damage range. And a high end of the damage range will be being super lucky and hitting all my 90% crit in all 10 rounds as well. Which, if we think about it on a high level, there's like a 10% chance of missing 1 out of every 10. So in 10 total rounds, if she acts 20 times in total, I will be on estimate missing about 2 out of 20. So there is still a small chance for me to hit all 20 out of 20, and that small chance is determined by the amount of crit rate that I have. By reducing the amount of crit rate that I have and increasing the amount of crit damage, what I'm actually doing is widening this range. So instead of previously, let's say my max damage was just hitting all these 91% crit damage stat on the enemy multiplied by 20 turns, that will be my cap off of damage. But now if I reduce it maybe by 10% here and increase this by 10% to 100%, my highest possible damage, I'm not talking about probability of hitting, I'm talking about possibility of damage here, is actually shifted towards the right, and now I might have a chance of clearing this floor with a small probability. So I think some of you are kind of get my gist, or more or less getting it, the idea that I'm bringing right here now. I think this brings into the concept of time. And a lot of us, especially in thinking of it in a one-dimensional damage sense, we are not thinking of the fact that you can actually do this, press escape, return, and just restart the entire battle thereafter. And when we keep doing this, going in and over again, you are actually exchanging time for a better probability of hitting a higher damage range. If we only go in once and exit the stage, unless you have 100% crit rate on all your characters, most likely you will be having a certain range, and sometimes you might clear it easier than others, and that is the reason why, because there's an element of RNG within the match itself. So that's what I mean by increasing damage ranges for characters, and why I think in the early game it might be beneficial is because if your range is not even able to meet the threshold damage of that particular floor, then it doesn't matter. You just want to clear it as consistently. But for some of us, maybe if you're pushing 2 stars, or maybe like you have this one and this one already, and you're just looking for that final win with at least 20 cycles left, and maybe you are feeling that you are always running out of time, you don't have enough damage, you have the sustain, but you don't have the damage, I think that this video definitely will be enlightening for you, and you can consider switching your ratio up a bit in terms of dropping your crit rate a little bit, increasing your crit damage, and if you have a little bit more time and you can try it out a bit more, like go in, fight the floor, like go in and fight the floor once and then restart and try again, you might find that because of the number of attempts that you do, you will be hitting at much higher damage ranges than you would have if you were playing at your previous crit ratios that you had. Maybe if you're running a 1:2 of like a 50 to 100, shifting it down to, for example, 40 to 120, you might notice an increase in your DPS in your highest set as well. And that difference of 20% might be enough to clear you the floor, for example. And I think that that is a significant difference, especially in the early game when we still have a bit of uncertainty. Of course, a disclaimer is as we are entering late game, for example, if we have characters that are already very, very well built, we have this like maybe at 80, 200, for example, then that won't really make much of a difference. But I think for those people who are concerned with clearing the Memory of Chaos, most likely you will have damage ratios like mine, or maybe slightly worse if maybe you started playing a bit later in the in Honkai Star Rail's official release. And those are some things that I want to share. What do you think? Leave me a comment below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Does it make sense to you as well? And otherwise, if you are interested to see like the crit ratio chart that I had previously, where it's like purely mathematical, take a look in this video right here. Otherwise, I want to actually talk about another thing in another video, which is going to be on the right here, and that is where to compare when is Celestial Differentiator better than Inert Salsoto. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.